Okay, our speakers tonight is Dr. William Keegan. Dr. Keegan is curator of Caribbean archaeology at the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville and professor of anthropology and Latin American studies at the University of Florida. Over the past 30 years, he has directed research projects in Trinidad, Grenada, St. Lucia, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, Jamaica, Grand Cayman, Turks and Caicos, and throughout the Bahamas. So he's got a pretty cool gig. One of his main interests is the ways that prehistoric people used to see. Lindsay Keegan is a junior majoring in zoology at the University of Florida. Currently, she's studying sexual selection in horseshoe crabs. She's assisted on archaeological research projects in the Caribbean since she was old enough to walk. She's worked on a variety of projects as a lab tech in Southeastern Archaeological Research, which is where I work. And she was an assistant on 3 marine biology projects in the Bahamas and currently has an HHMI fellowship to study horseshoe crabs. And so with that, I'll present Dr. Keegan and Lindsay Keegan.
Thanks, Bob. Good to see you again, and some of my other friends who have spent a little bit of time at the University of Florida. Really appreciate being invited. I need to hold it up. Okay. Really appreciate being invited here, and it's a pleasure to come down and visit with you all. We're going to talk tonight about some research that we're doing with in fishing, and especially with net weights. We're going to do a tag team, so I'm going to start out with an introduction, then Lindsay's going to talk about the research that she's been doing, and then I'll finish up with a little bit more about fishing practices. This project came about while I was doing a consultation on a project with SEARCH, Southeastern Archaeological Research, Bob's company, in Puerto Rico. And you know, one of the great things I find about working with volunteers and new students is that they frequently ask me questions that either I didn't think of or I don't have the answer to. And one of the questions that came up was why so many of the clams that we were finding had holes in the shell. Now, at one point, it was explained that this is how you got the animal out of the shell. But as Lindsay will talk to you, that's not a good explanation. Another suggestion by Charles Hoffman was that these were actually strung together like a wind chime and hung in agricultural fields to chase away birds. Possibility, could be, but not likely. And in trying to deal with these, I remembered that the Florida Museum of Natural History has a remarkable collection of artifacts from Key Marco, and that quite a few of these are identified as shell net weights, and in fact some of them even have cordage still attached to them. So I went and talked to Bill Marquardt and Karen Walker about the collection, and they said no one has ever studied it. So fishing is a really important aspect of the cultures of the Caribbean and Florida. And so we tried to do, what I decided to do was a project in which we could get a clearer understanding of the characteristics of shell net weights. So I needed a special person to do this. And give me that. And so I turned to my daughter. Now, Lindsay had been working on marine biology projects, as Bob said, for quite a number of years. She's now working with Dr. Jane Brockman on horseshoe crab study. And she's familiar with archaeology. And so I was looking for somebody who could understand the mindset of an archaeologist, but see through the eyes of a marine biologist. And so that's how she got involved. And so what Lindsay's been doing is working on several collections, one from Key Marco, one from, actually 2 from SEARCH now, one from Boca Beach and one from Puerto Rico.
So I looked to Is it okay if I tilt this down? Otherwise, it's right in my eyes. My dad mentioned that I was working on 3 different collections, and for this talk, I only compared the Puerto Rico collection with the Key Marco collection, just because of lack of time to get everything together. So I was looking at the net weights from Key Marco and from Puerto Rico, and I found that the weights of the arc shells from the Key Marco collection are normally distributed. And this is to be expected when collecting the shells, if they just went out and collected all of the shells that they came across. However, it's not totally random. Since they were stacking the shells inside of each other with the umbos, the umbo of the previous one on top of the umbo of the underneath one, it would make sense that there would be more medium-sized shells, because the medium-sized shells can both be stacked inside large shells and can have small shells stacked inside of them. So I should then mention that there is a correlation between both the shell length and shell weight, and between the shell width and the shell weight. When referring to the size of the shell, this way you can tell that it's very linear. So you can see that when I'm referring to the size of the shell, I mean both the weight and the overall dimensions. Let me go back. There we go. So the shells from Puerto Rico, unlike the shells from Key Marco, are bimodally distributed. And so there is one peak right here at 5 and then another one at 9. Whereas, oh, do I have a pointer? Okay, it's a red button. So there's a peak here at 5 and then another peak here at 9, whereas the Key Marco shells are, with the exception of 10 grams, normally distributed. And this also makes sense in the way that they're stacking, because the Key Marco shells are stacked inside the umbo, as I said, but the Puerto Rico shells are stacked on top of each other like pancakes. And so you'd want them to be of similar size. So you would want a group of similar size and then another group of similar size. And that would explain why you're getting the 2 different peaks. The most puzzling result is right here from Key Marco, the fact that there are none at 10 grams. There are 26 shells that weigh 9 grams and 18 shells that weigh 11 grams, but there are only 7 shells that weigh 10 grams. And as of yet, this phenomena has not been explained. My dad and I spent the majority of the car ride down talking about this, and we've spent the whole summer talking about it, but we still can't figure out why that might be. So, while the distributions of the weight may indicate a random collection of shells, the valve side most certainly does not. The Key Marco collection has the majority of them. So the Key Marco is the dark green, and the Puerto Rico collection is the kind of sage green. So the Puerto Rico collection has majority of left valves, whereas the Key Marco collection has majority of right valves. And if they were collecting all of the shells off of the beach or in some population out in the water, you would expect them to be 50-50. However, since they do, especially the Key Marco shells, since they stack very nicely inside of each other when they're all of the same valve, it makes sense to have, more of one valve than the other. But this preference of valve is not just in these 2 collections. There's also been a study by George Lure on quahog shells in the Gulf Coast and central and southern Florida, in which he found mostly left valve shells as well. So for some reason, across multiple collections, there's a preference for valve. So, and like I said, this preference can partially be explained because like valves stack better together. However, if both halves were collected, the left half from the Key Marco collection and the right half from the Puerto Rico collection must have been discarded or used for another purpose, which again, we have no explanation for what that purpose is or why they were being discarded. So, as you can see, there are holes punched. This isn't the best picture for it, but there are holes punched in the umbo of all of these shells. And the very first picture showed it much better. It showed all these shells from the top. But interestingly, these holes are punched consistently within the collection, but not consistently between collections. Oh, apparently there's a clicker on the bottom. No, it's okay. You can leave it there. So the Key Marco collection has much more ovular holes, while the Puerto Rico collection has almost perfectly circular holes. Since the shells are different species, it's to be expected that they would break differently. However, if the holes were natural, we would expect the sizes to be normally distributed, but as you can see, they're not. So this is the Key Marco collection, and these are the holes, and they're very skewed. They're skewed left. And these are the Puerto Rico collection, and as you can see, the difference between the hole width and the hole length is much, much smaller. So the difference between the hole width and the hole length is 0.01%. And so there's hardly any difference, where these, there's a much bigger difference, showing that these are much more circular and these are much more ovular. And the sage green on both of these is the overall size of the shell. And so this is showing that there's no correlation between the size of the hole and the size of the shell. The size of the shell is very normally distributed in both collections, and the hole size is very skewed in both collections. So a normal distribution is indicative of a natural phenomena, and some sort of a skewed distribution is much more indicative of a man-made phenomena. Another indicator that these shells were not just picked up off the beach with holes in them is the blowout pattern. Based on this pattern, we can see that they were all punched from the inside. So they were all punched from the inside. And this, in combination with the consistency in hole size, indicates that the pattern in making the holes implies not only one method, but one tool was used to make the hole for each collection. I previously mentioned that the two collections were stacked differently. The Key Marco shells were stacked inside the umbo, one above the other, while the Kodachia from Puerto Rico were stacked flat like pancakes. And this explains the placement of the holes. The holes from Key Marco shells, these are the Key Marco shells, the holes are all right inside the umbo, whereas the holes from the Puerto Rico shells are in the middle of the back. I think that's, yes. So they're all in the middle of the back. And so they would stack very nicely on top of each other, and you can string a hole right you can string a string right through the holes. Another characteristic of these shells that is indicative of their use is their wear patterns. Almost all of the worn areas of the shells are on raised parts of the shells. The only exception to this pattern is wear on the inside of the shell, and this is consistent with stacking. So on the Kodachia shells, the wear pattern would be there's more up towards the top of the shell, and on these you can see the wear pattern where there's some on the back right there, and there would be some on the inside in the corresponding with where that would rub. Also, most of the shells are worn on the lip. This is to be expected when shells are tied together and dragged across the bottom of the sand on a net. And another common wear pattern, especially in the Key Marco collection, is wear along the umbo, and this is likely to be from rubbing with the cordage. And so this is the picture of the inside, and you can't really tell, but the lip is really worn. And there is a much better picture of how it's worn across the lip, and that would be from dragging it across the sand. And so this leads us to one conclusion about the similarities between Taino Indians and flamenco dancers. Let's see if this works. They both cast a net. And now I'm going to hand it over to my dad. There you go, Dad.
My bad sense of humor. Anyway, this project's been really exciting to me because it just started out as a chance to look at a few artifacts that hadn't been looked at before and to get some ideas. And as you see from the stats, that Lindy's put up, we've gotten some really interesting new ideas about fishing and especially net weights. And I know that oftentimes these seemingly mundane artifacts don't attract a great deal of attention, but one of the issues, I think, is that we haven't looked really closely at fishing and what we would expect to see in fishing societies. And so we're, I think, finally beginning to take a closer look. And maybe if my dad had taken me fishing when I was a kid, I'd be better at it. David Hurst Thomas has a great new book out about St. Catherine's Island in Georgia. And I don't know the historical reference for this photograph, but it shows various kind of fish pots, weirs, people spearing fish, nets, using canoes, not to mention the strange sea creatures that are represented as well. But I think what is really key here is the diversity of practices by people who lived close to the sea. And it's one thing to just say that people went fishing, but it's far more interesting to get at their cultural behavior behind that fishing. And also, especially to get at the sociality of fishing and the social practices associated with it. Bartolomé de las Casas mentions that in Lucayan society in the Bahamas, that women men did the gardening or prepared the gardens, but women made the fishing nets. And so we have a gender complementarity in which the men make the women's gardening possible and the women make the men's fishing possible. So there's all kinds of interesting subtext to the story of fishing. Oops.
Yeah, there's a button underneath. Be careful.
Yeah.
Nope, you're going the wrong way.
So one of the things that we're doing, it used to be anytime you found a piece of shell with a hole in it, somebody must have worn it as jewelry. And we're rethinking that. And here's a couple of examples. This is a small cowrie from Puerto Rico, and this is a flamingo-tongued snail. The flamingo-tongued snail is actually a really brilliant white color when it's been cleaned or when the animal has died. There's hardly any food in it. Nobody would ever collect these things to eat. And the holes, as you see, are really, really rough. And the holes that we see in objects that we think were made for jewelry are very smooth and very precise and very delicate. People put extra effort into making things for jewelry. So we're looking at these now as possible fishing implements. There was our previous photograph, there were some oyster shells on the top. The same thing. The oyster shells would have made beautiful spinners. And there are a lot of fish, barracuda especially, which we see quite frequently in the archaeological sites, that are very attracted to shiny objects. So hook and line was probably used. These could have just been line sinkers. They could have also served to attract fish. But we're moving beyond just simply counting and weighing and throwing out shells as food refuse. We know that the Tainos had a whole variety of different techniques, just as the photograph from Dave Thomas's book shows. This is a basket trap from Haiti. It's a modern one. They're still in use today. There's the fish are drawn into these triangular areas. They go through a little trap door, and once they get in, they can't turn around and get back out again. One of the things about fish traps is that they're really useful in that they have a particular mesh size. So small fish can escape while larger fish get trapped. And by knowing the mesh size and knowing the characteristics of the fish, you can measure their vertebra and see if you have that consistent range within your archaeological deposits. This little grouper didn't want to go in the trap. But traps also, it's sometimes suggested that they only attract herbivorous fish, that the carnivores don't go in there, that the fish that are eating the coral and the algae are the ones that get trapped. But what we found, I didn't experiment back 20 years ago, and indeed carnivorous fish will go in there to get the other fish, the smaller fish, that are already trapped. And so we do get carnivorous fish in these as well. Again, trapping, biologists have done a whole bunch of different studies on fish traps. Archaeologists talk about fish traps a lot. I've rarely seen reference to the biological studies of fish and fish traps. So I think it's another area that we need to look at more closely. One of the really strange fishing practices in the Caribbean was reported by Gonzalo Oviedo. Oviedo said that this remora fish, which has a sucker on the top of its head and is known to attach to larger fish and... Is that my phone? Sorry. I'd turn it off, but I don't know how to turn it back on again. They would tie a line, whoops, to the back of the remora fish. Give me my talk away. And then let it free. And when the fish attached the top of its head to a sea turtle or to a shark, they would reel it in and capture the fish. And I always thought that this was sort of one of those funny old Spanish chronicler's tales. Is that how you'd put it? But a friend of mine was cleaning his boat and said, these fish are incredibly aggressive. He had to get out of the water in order to keep the fish from attaching itself. And these plates are like the pinchers on a crab, so it's not something very pleasant. But apparently the Tainos used this practice to capture large fish and turtles. Another thing that we know about from the Caribbean is that they use spears. And Columbus talks about them using the tooth of a fish to tip the top of their spears. It's possible that it could have been a shell. We do actually have barracuda teeth that have been drilled and made into pendants. But the more common is the stingray spine, which are found in a number of archaeological sites. And a lot of them show wear as if they've been used like a spear. In fact, one of them was used, there's a burial from Ma Isabel in Puerto Rico in which there's actually a stingray spine stuck in a person's rib cage. So obviously they tipped some sort of projectile with that, and it proved to be particularly deadly for that individual. Okay, so that's a quick trip through fishing practices in the Caribbean. We want to, first of all, thank Dr. Betsy Carlson at Search, who made the Puerto Rico material available. Barb Shively took a bunch of the fish photographs, and Bill Marquardt and Karen Walker have been working with Lindsay on the actual analysis. The picture is the cover of the book that Betsy and I just put out. It is a series of essays that we've been writing for a popular magazine in the Turks and Caicos Islands that Alabama Press collected and put into one book. There's 15 color plates and about 60 photographs. It deals with all aspects of natural history in the Caribbean, but looking at it from the Indian perspective, from what the names that the Indians used, from what we've seen in archaeological sites, how things were in the past, how they are today, commonalities, discontinuities and such. I brought one copy which I'm going to give to the society to do with as they want, put it in their library or auction it off to raise money for the society. Or I don't have more copies. Amazon has it on sale right now, so it's about, I think they're selling it for about 25 bucks. We don't make much in the way of royalties, so pushing the book isn't gonna make me rich, unless you see it on the New York Times bestseller list, in which case we'll see what happens. So anyway, just to wrap things up, we started out with a problem. We had shells with a hole in them, and we didn't know what they were used for. We didn't have any comparative material to try and interpret what they might have been used for. We had material from Florida that no one had looked at previously or documented previously. And so I managed to put Lindsay to work on that. And so by looking at shells that we know that were used for net weights, looking at the characteristics, and I think one of the key things is finding wear evidence on them, the grinding along the edge, the way that the hole is blown out in the umbo, the way that there's wear on the inside and the rougher exterior surfaces, in particular places, are really helping us to understand how these nets were used. One of the other things, you took a couple of my slides out. One of the other things is we're also seeing ways in which these might have been used that we haven't looked at before. For example, Richard Price, in his report on fishing practices in the Caribbean, suggested that there were no cast nets. I mean, those of you who fish, can you imagine having a cast net to go out and get bait at least? And what we see with these objects is that they're aerodynamically ideal for use as cast nets, because as you're spinning them, they're flying horizontally. And when they hit the water, they immediately turn vertically and drop down. I mean, you could not design a better shape for a cast net. And so we're exploring the possibility that cast nets were actually being used, and then looking at what kinds of fish would be caught in cast nets. So the shell work is just part of a larger effort to look more closely at fishing practices. Any of you guys have any suggestions, you can find me online. Any of you who are fishermen and can think of something based on this talk, or you want to ask some questions and offer suggestions, that would be great, because that's how this is all moving forward, is with people who see connections that aren't necessarily obvious to those of us who are doing it all the time. So with that, I'm going to stop, and we'll be happy to take questions.